Welcome to Abundant EM. We are glad you are here today. We are nearing the end of this volume, and here we are today in the Law and Life, and it is Consequences for the Faithless out of Numbers 14. So if you can all stand, we're going to read the word of the Lord out loud together. There are 5 slides, so me first, or all together, then me, all together, then me, and all together, okay? You guys ready? Ready? Numbers 14, verse 11 and 12, ready, begin. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will these people treat me with contempt? Will they never believe me, even after all the miraculous signs I have done among them? I will disown them and destroy them with a plague. Then I will make you into a nation greater and mightier than they are. But Moses objected. What will the Egyptians think when they hear about it? Now, if you destroy them, the Egyptians will send a report to the inhabitants of this land. If you slaughter all these people with a single blow, the nations that have heard of your fame will say, the Lord was not able to bring them into the land he swore to give them, so he killed them in the wilderness. Next slide, ready? All together, ready, begin. Please, Lord, prove that your power is as great as you have claimed. For you said the Lord is slow to anger and filled with unfailing love, forgiving every kind of sin and rebellion. But he does not excuse the guilty. He lays the sins of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected, even children in the 3rd and 4th generations. In keeping with your magnificent unfailing love, please pardon the sins of this people. Then the Lord said, I will pardon them as you have requested. But as surely as I live, not one of these people will enter that land. They have all seen my glorious presence and the miraculous signs I performed both in Egypt and in the wilderness. But again and again they have tested me by refusing to listen to my voice. They will never even see the land I swore to give their ancestors. None of those who have treated me with contempt will ever see it. Last one, all together, ready? Begin. But my servant Caleb has a different attitude than the others have. He has remained loyal to me, so I will bring him into the land he explored. His descendants will possess their full share of that land. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. So here we are in our unit on Law and Life, and we're moving through the books of Exodus through Deuteronomy. And today we're in the book of Numbers, and Numbers has some of the most important lessons for us to learn from the Israelites. And I would argue to say today's story is probably one of the most tragic points in Israel's history. The rest of the Bible actually refers back to this moment often, okay? How many of you can think of a moment in your life that you have lived long enough that you're like, man, that thing that happened, that was kind of a rough period of my life. And because of that, a lot of my life turned out kind of hard that way. Okay? Think about a moment, whether it was being bullied when you were younger or losing a parent or whatever it may be. We've all experienced something in our lives that was a turning point. Now, this is Israel's turning point. This is one of the most tragic stories, and yet in it, there's much for us to learn. We can judge all we want and say, Israel, man, when will you guys get the picture? And yet last week we realized, right? We are often like the Israelites. They have seen all of God's miracles, and yet again, on the second Passover, so the anniversary of their being freed, they're sitting there complaining. Now, here we are. They are a mere reflection of us, the Israelites. And so what is it that God is trying to speak to us today? In essence, he's warning us and encouraging us to choose a different path than they did. So here's the context. Remember Abraham? Way back when? He's important because remember, way back before that, in the garden, what was God's promise to Adam and Eve? Yes, Adam and Eve, you royally screwed up. But I have a plan. And the plan is that one day a man will come from your line who will be my son who will save the world, right? Which means that he needs to come through one family. Do you guys know in the Bible, most of you guys say, what is the most boring part to read? The genealogies, where it's like this son, this man had this son, had this son, had this son, had this, and you're like, oh my gosh, it looks boring to us. But a good Jewish person is seeing the connection all the way from Adam to Abraham, from Abram all the way down to King David, all the way down to Jesus. Because through this one family, God chose Abraham. He was nothing special. He was a pagan man living in a pagan country whose dad could not follow God's instructions. And yet, Abraham was the one chosen. He had how many sons? Well, more than one. But the one son, Isaac. What was the promise? You would have many descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. And you would have what? Land and blessing. One son turned into 2 million people now wandering in the wilderness, following a cloud by day and a fire by night. Abraham, one man, at 100 years old. Who has seen a 100-year-old person nowadays? Okay? That's real old to have a baby. Real old. Okay, real old. And now again, in that time, they lived a different lifespan, so it was a little bit different. But he was definitely way past middle age, though. Okay? 100 years old, having a baby. That one son turned into 2 million people. Now they left, remember Jacob left his hometown and went to Egypt to be with Joseph, his son. And God told him it was okay to go. They were gone for 400 plus years. If you leave a land for 400 plus years, do you think no one is going to live in there? No. They did not hold their spot. Over those 400 plus years the Israelites were living in Egypt, other people had come into that land. And so now God has delivered them, mightily freed them out of slavery, and now they are right at the front door of the promised land, right at the front door of the very land that Abraham walked on, that God said, this is the land I will give you and your descendants. This is a promise, hundreds and centuries in the making, And they are literally at the front door, okay? So they're at the front door, and Moses is like, okay, we should get a good idea of what we're walking into. So he picks 12 men, one from each tribe. Each of Jacob's sons turned into a tribe, right? One man from each tribe, send them out for 40 days to scope out the land. And they come back, these 12 spies. They come back with a giant cluster of grapes. Who has seen, like Costco grapes are pretty big. Okay, but imagine that one cluster of grapes so large that 2 grown men the size of Nick have to hold it between their shoulders. He's tall, okay? He's tall. Like, think about how tall Nick is, and 2 guys like that carrying a giant cluster of grapes between them. That's how fruitful the land is. These are people who are complaining about eating manna. Okay? And they're like, dude, we've been eating manna. Look at the food that's in here. This is truly a land flowing with milk and honey. But they come back with a good news, bad news report. If someone says, do you want good news or bad news? What do you ask for first? The bad news, okay? But they were dumb and they gave the good news first. They're like, look at this food. Look at how wonderful it is. But here's the bad news. Now, this was not their job. Moses told them, go scout it out. Figure out what's going on there so we can strategize how to defeat them, right? Their job was not to come back and bring bad news. But they came back and they said, look, yes, the land is fruitful, but their cities are so fortified we can never defeat them. Their men, their giants. Their soldiers are the size of giants, truly. Goliath, David and Goliath. These are Goliath's ancestors, okay? We're talking about, these are giant men, over 9 feet tall. And they're like, there is no way we can defeat them. Now, there is some truth to that. You're right. According to your power and your strength, there's no way you can. But they had forgotten that this was God's promise, hundreds of years in the making. So here we are, and they have complained and said, there's no way. Out of their fear, 10 men, remember 12 men went in. They all saw the same thing. 10 said, there's no way that we can defeat them. 2 of them said, what are you talking about? God is with us. Let's go right now. We can beat him up, okay? Those were those 2, Joshua and Caleb. But who do you think Israel listened to? The report of 2 or the report of 10? The report of 10. And those 10 men Literally, their bad report spread throughout 2 million people. That's how quickly it was. And here is God and his reaction. Okay, don't forget, God has literally set them free. Plagues, Passover, Red Sea, bread from heaven, water. There are so many moments of miracles and provision. And the Mount Sinai, the 10 Commandments, there are so many things that have happened in this last year where God was teaching them how to trust him. And in this ultimate test, yet again, they failed. So here's the thing. Here's our first point. We go to the next slide. The first point is this: God is faithful to forgive even when his people are faithless. Now look here. Verse 11. The Lord said to Moses, how long? How long? Okay. How long will it take for them to treat me with contempt? What more do I have to do to show and to prove my character and who I am? Will they never believe me even after all that I have done? Now, just because God is God does not mean he will just let these people do whatever they want, right? God is a God of emotion as well. And he is angered by this just as much as we would be if we were him. Right? Like, what more do I have to do? At this rate, you are never going to believe me. And so he's like, you know what? Start from scratch. Erase the board, and start from Moses and his family. Let's just start over again. Now, this is not just a one-time act of rebellion. In other words, Israel is saying this: I'd rather go back into slavery, I'd rather go back into bondage than believe in God's promise of blessing. That's what they're saying. They're saying, I'd rather go back to what I know, even if it means being a slave, than to trust in the unknown that God has promised ahead of me. Do you guys see how scary that fear is? That fear of the unknown, that fear of what is going to happen next, that fear of, can I truly trust in God? That fear, you guys, if that fear, let me just give you the answer. We all have that fear. Okay, no one's fear of that is stronger than somebody else. All of us have that fear, and all of us will face a moment like this in our lives where we have to trust. But that fear can be really powerful. It is clear that God took this personally this time. He's like, yo, what more do I have to do? In what ways are you and I like the Israelites today? In what ways do you and I doubt God's plans for us? When things don't pan out for our good, when things don't go well, how easily do we fall into doubt? We are just like them. We cannot judge. They actually saw the miracles. None of us have walked through the Red Sea. None of us have seen bread fall from the sky. They did, and yet they still did not trust. And so in what ways do we also struggle with those same fears? With those same fears. Verse 13, but Moses objected, and he objected on 2 accounts. He said, God, look, I gotta talk you down from your anger, Lord, because here's the thing. Number 1, if you wipe us out, what will Egypt say? And what will the other nations say? Now, for us, this doesn't seem like a big deal to us because we live in a different culture, right? But back in that day, when you went to war, in that time, remember, what's the most important thing in Scripture? Understand the context, okay? In that time, when they went out to war, it was nation against nation. And they would bring their gods with them, okay? So whatever little golden cow they had, they would bring it with them, okay? And that was the banner they fought under, was their God. And guess what? Whoever won, that God was stronger than the other nation's God, okay? This is big God showdown. And so if your nation lost, your God was weaker than theirs. So it's not just about which nation is weaker. It's about, your God is weaker, okay? That's kind of how they fought back in the day. And so his idea is, Lord, if you do this, which you have every right to do as God, but God, if you do this, what will the other nations say? Because remember, God, the third blessing that you gave Abraham was that through this nation, the whole world would know who the one true God is. That's why Egypt was so powerful. The 10 plagues were so powerful because God was not just showing Israel who God was. He was showing Egypt and the rest of the world who God was. Okay? And so this is more at line than just these 2 million rebellious people. This is about him being like, God, think about it again, okay? If you do this, what will they say? What will they say? Now, he appeals to him on that sense. And then he also says this. The second appeal is in verse 17. This is the more important one. In verse 17, Moses says this, please, Lord, prove that your power is as great as you have claimed. This is not Moses being like, yo, God, show up, man, okay? This is him with all respect being like, Lord, I know you are powerful. I know you are. You got to show up for us in that way. He's saying, didn't you say, God, the Lord is slow to anger? Didn't you say that you're slow to anger? Didn't you say you are filled with unfailing love? Didn't you say that you forgive every sin? But you also do not excuse the guilty. And then it says, in keeping with your magnificent and unfailing love, please pardon your sins. Now, the first appeal was important. Like, God, think about the nations. But the second appeal was more important. God, you said this is who you are. You said you are slow to anger. Where does this sound familiar? It's earlier in Exodus 34. We already read this. This is the most important passage in Exodus 34, where God himself explains who he is. This is who I am. This is how I am different than any other God in this world that they say they are gods. Moses is appealing to God's character because God does not change. He does not change. The same God yesterday, today is the same God of tomorrow. In other words, the God of Exodus 34 is the same God of Numbers 14, is the same God for us today. Today. Note that Moses is appealing on God's character, not on our worthiness. He's not saying, God, look at your people. Don't they look so sad? Like, don't they look so cute and pitiful? Like, please help us. That's not what Moses is saying. Moses is like, dude, these people are great. But Lord, please, I know you, and you are slow to anger. In other words, forgiveness is not given to us because we deserve it. Forgiveness is given to us because of who God is. Let me say that again. Forgiveness is not given to us because we deserve it. Forgiveness is given to us because of who God is in his character. Nothing you ever do can earn you Jesus. Nothing you ever do can earn you Jesus. The gift of God's forgiveness is given to us because of God's character. So the God of Exodus 34 is the God of Numbers 14, is the God of your life right now, sitting here in 2025. What are the ways that maybe you and I have been relying on our own worthiness to come to God? God, if I go to church enough, if I read the Bible enough, if I pray enough, that will make me worthy to come before you. Those things are important. But we do it because we know who we are before God, not to earn who we are before God. Does that make sense? We don't come, we don't read, we don't worship, we don't pray. We don't do those things to earn God's love. We do it because we know we are loved by God. My friends, in this Christian life, you will have seasons where you will experience that, where you know it in your head, I don't earn God's love, but you find yourself living and hustling like that. And then we get burned out, and then we get discouraged, and then we wonder why we're so tired. Well, friends, maybe it was because we have forgotten that we could never earn God's love. We do these things because we know we are loved. we know we are loved. But remember, God does forgive those who are faithless, who doubt him. Remember, he has every right to be like, done. Like, that's enough. I gave you enough chances. Game over. He had full right to do that. And yet he does not. He does not. He actually listens to Moses and is like, okay, you know what? Here we go. I'm not going to. But that leads me to point number 2. Where there's a point 1, there's a point 2, okay? And point 1 was that God forgives the faithless, but point 2 is equally important. And point 2 is this, our next slide. Faithlessness is forgiven, and yet there are still consequences, okay? We have to remember that. God does forgive us for doubting him, for being faithless in how we live for him, and yet there are still ripple effects of that. Verse 20, the Lord said, I will pardon them as you have requested. Do you know that one sentence says so much more than we could ever realize about God? God, who has every right to do what he says, you know what? Okay, I will forgive. But not one of these people will ever enter that land. Why? Because again and again and again and again they have tested me and they have refused to listen to my voice. So here's the thing. This is not about how many miracles they saw. This is about a heart issue. God was saying they chose not to listen to me. They saw all the things. They had time after time after time to follow me, and yet in the hardness of their heart, they chose not to listen. And so they will never see the land, even though I swore I would give it to them. It will not be them that see it, but their children. Remember back, God says that he will not pardon the guilty, but the sins of the parents will go upon the children. In the idea that sin has repercussions that will impact the whole family. So God technically could have been like 3rd or 4th generation. You know what? You will wander for so many years that your children's children's children, they're the ones that can enter. But even in the consequence, God was merciful. And he said, your children will see it. Your children will see it, even though you will not. This is one of the greatest tragedies in Israel's history. Though their lives were spared, they never entered the promised land. Here we see the perfect connection of God's mercy and God's justice. God spared them, forgave them, even though they didn't have to. And yet the justice came together and said, there are consequences for your faithlessness. And so you will wander for 40 years in the front yard. Okay? Think about your family. Whoever remembers growing up, when I was growing up, so we live in Arizona, right? There are not a lot of 2-story houses because it's so stinking hot, okay, where we lived. And so there are a lot of big, like, ranch style, like, bigger, like, sprawled out, like, 1-story houses a lot in Arizona. And I remember, like, you know, when you're a kid, you just think about, like, 2 stories, that is a big house. And so occasionally there's, like, a 2-story house in the neighborhood. And I remember, like, being like, oh, they're so cool. They live in a 2-story house. Their house is so big. You know, it's the same square footage. But, like, that house looks so big and so grand. Think about buying that house as a kid, and you get the keys, but you cannot enter the house. You have to live in a tent in the front yard. Like, think about that. How sad that would be. You bought the house, but you can't go in. The keys don't work. And you have to live in a tent in front of the house. That's what that's like for the Israelites. They are literally at the front door. And for the next 40 years, they will wander in the front yard, in the wilderness, until that whole generation dies away. That's the greatest tragedy they ever had. Except for 2 men. Here in verse 24. But my servant Caleb has a different attitude. He saw the same land. He had the same task. but he came back and he was loyal to me. So I will bring him in. Caleb and Joshua were the two oldest people to enter the promised land because they're the only two that survived. Moses also did not enter the land. We're going to see later why he didn't. He also died before entering the land. Joshua, Caleb, they were the ones, the next generation were the ones who entered the promised land. They were the minority of the 12, the 10 that said no. They said yes. Here's Caleb in Numbers 13:30. Caleb tried to quiet the people as they stood before Moses. Let's go at once. We can certainly conquer it. How did this man have such a different perspective? They saw the same thing. They had the same job. They did the same work. And yet he came back and said, yo, let's go. God can do this. And 10 said no. And through those 10, think about it. This is Joshua and Caleb's peers. My grandma's 92 years old, okay? That lady, she's watching right now, okay? She 100% is. She can't understand a thing, but she always presses the thumbs up button. She called me, she's like, one time I pressed it twice and it went away. I was like, Grandma, you gotta press it another time. She's like, okay, I can't press it twice. And I was like, no, you can't press it twice. You gotta press it once. All right, that one thumbs up on her EM message, y'all, is my 92-year-old grandma, okay? And so my grandma, where's it going with this? Oh, she's 92, okay? The last 10 years of her life, whenever I talk to her, I'm like, how you doing, Grandma? She's like, you know what? Nobody died this week. It was a good week. That's how she talks, literally, because all her friends are dying away. That's like the reality of her life right now. Like if no one dies that week, that is a good week, friends, you know? My grandma got lots of friends, so that means lots of people dying. But can you imagine, like Joshua and Caleb watching their friends die in the wilderness? Knowing that, man, this is why if we had just believed, we could have been living in the promised land. We could have already conquered this. But instead, we're waiting for 40 more years until all my friends die and I get to go in and lead a next generation of punks into the promised land. That's what they had to live through. Here's the thing. What made them different? My friends, the line in the sand as Christians is only one thing. Remember, this is not Egypt we're talking about. We're talking about Israel. These are God's people who saw God's miracles. And yet they did not enter the promised land. What was the line in the stand, even among God's people? That line is faith. Will you believe in me or will you not? That is it. At the end of the day, that is the question you will answer when you face the Lord at the end of your life. That is the question you will answer is, did you have faith in me or no? Did you live according to that faith in me or no? That is the only thing you will answer for. What makes the difference? It is faith. Now, the Israelites are the greatest analogy for us as Christians today. Think about it. They were bound to sin and slavery in Egypt. They were born into it. They had no choice. They were born into sin, right? Okay, this sounds a little familiar. All right. And then God raises up one man who will deliver them out of Egypt, who will free them from slavery. One man, Jesus. Okay, does that look familiar? There is one man who will deliver them, bring them through the waters, just like baptism, right? And then now they begin to figure out, you can take the person out of Egypt, but it is very hard to take Egypt out of the person, right? Like they are physically out of slavery, but the old ways of being a slave in their mind is very hard to cure. And so they wander through the wilderness to learn how to trust in God, how to live by faith that he will daily provide for us. Okay, this analogy of Israel is just like us today as Christians. It takes faith to believe that Jesus will set you free If you don't realize you're in sin and a slave, you don't realize you need Jesus, right? I've told you guys before the story of the person that I met in my program who was trafficked by her own parents growing up. And because she was trafficked as a young child, she didn't realize it was different, right? Until she got older and realized something is not okay about this, you know? When we grow up and live in sin and slavery, we don't always realize the issue until one day we realize the issue. And we're like, I need Jesus to set me free. And that is faith. That takes faith. But it's not enough to start your journey as a Christian on faith. You have to continue your journey as a Christian in faith. Because being saved, that's just day one, my friends. What comes after? Because, okay, let's be honest. Plagues, Passover, Red Sea, that's kind of cool. That's the cool stuff, okay? But you know what's the hard stuff? Walking through the wilderness. Getting tired of the same old thing. Getting thirsty, getting hungry. That's the hard part of being a Christian, is learning how to trust he's going to provide. Learning how to follow him even when it doesn't make sense. Learning how to be content and not grumble. That's the hard stuff. Because the ones who can endure the wilderness, who learn how to trust him, they're the ones who enter the promised land of eternal rest. Does that make sense? Our end goal is the promised land too. But we can't just go from Egypt, jump, Mario into the promised land. That's not how it works. We have to all go through the wilderness. We all have to learn how to trust in God. We all have to learn how to have faith and how to live in faith, how to trust him to provide for your daily basic needs, how to trust that he will guide you, how to follow and listen to his voice. Those are the things that make you a Christian over the course of your life. And the thing that draws the line in the sand between the Joshuas and the Calebs and the rest of God's people who did not enter is faith. Is faith. That is the only thing that separates those two. So let me ask you today, where is your faith? What is God teaching you? What part of the wilderness are you in right now? Are you learning how to trust him in your basic needs? Are you learning how to trust him when the road ahead looks murky and you don't know where to go? Are you following his voice? Are you learning what it looks like to trust in him, to obey leaders that God has put in your life? What are the ways that you are learning in the wilderness? Because my friends, do not grow weary there, because that is where God wants you to be. That is where he's teaching you how to have faith, how to trust in him, because the end goal is the promised land, but no one can enter without faith. And no one learns faith except for wilderness, how to trust in him. Can I have the praise team come up? We're going to sing the song, Trust in God, because that is so easy, and yet that is so hard. That is one of the hardest things we learn to do. We learn it once, and we're like, oh yeah, God is so good. And then we're good for a while, and then we hit another season where God's calling you to level up, and it requires even more faith. That's what the Christian walk is like, my friends. Can we all stand? But the good news is we're not alone. Wandering alone in the desert is not as great as wandering together, unless you have bad companions who will cause you to wander the wrong way, okay? But here we are as a body in this faith journey. Do you really trust him? Do you really trust him? Because the line in the sand is faith. What divides the Joshuas and the Calebs from the rest of the people is faith. Will we live by faith? Will I live trusting in him?